Hello. We're welcome. Blah, 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 blah. Yes. Welcome back to the chapter 2 of the Hobbit reading. Last time we left off, Bilbo went to sleep after the dwarves had a meeting about what we should do with the the dragon in the mountain. And now we continue. Up jumped Bilbo. Oh, wait. Messed up. Chapter 2. Roast mutton. Up jumped Bilbo, and putting on his dressing gown went into the dining room. There he saw nobody but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real, that Bilbo was forced to believe that the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved after all that to think they had gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up, but with never a thank you, he thought. And yet, in a way, he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself, "thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age." So he put on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down with a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the open window, when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," said he, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start, and here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you a message because they could not wait." "What message?" And poor Mr. Bilbo Baggins was all in a fluster. "Great elephants," said Gandalf, "you're not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece." What's that got to do with it? I've had enough to do with washing up for 14. "If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this under the clock," said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own notepaper. This is what he read. "Thorn and Company to burglar Bilbo greeting. For your hospitality and sincere thanks, thank you, and for your offer of professional assistance on our grateful acceptance. Terms cash on delivering up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses are defrayed by our representatives, if occasion arises and the matter is otherwise not arranged for. Thinking it is unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations, and shall wait a respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual. We have the honor to remain yours deeply, Thorn and Company." "That leaves you about just 10 minutes. You'll have to run," said Gandalf. But, said Bilbo. "No time for it," said the wizard. But, said Bilbo again. "No time for that either. Go, off you go." To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, walking stick, or, say, money, or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second half-breakfast finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on a whole mile or more. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11, and found that he had come without a pocket handkerchief. "Bravo!" said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was very slung with all kinds of packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo. "Up you two get, and off we go," said Thorin. "I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I have come without my hat. I left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note until 10:45 to be precise." "Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry. You'll have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many other things before you get to journey's end. As for a hat, I've got a spare hood and cloak in my luggage." That's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May, on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father's bungo would have never thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was that he wouldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding for very long when Gandalf, very splendid on a white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except of course when they stopped for meals. They didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel adventures were not so bad after all. At first they passed through Hobbit lands a while, now then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to the lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone far into the lone lands where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were the dreary hills rising higher and with dark trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by the most wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had been taking a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had to camp when they could, but at least it had to be dry. "To think it will be soon June," grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time, it was pouring with rain, and it had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes, his cloak was full of water, the pony was tired and stumbled on stones, the others were too grumpy to talk. "And I'm sure that the rain has got into the dry clothes and the food bags," thought Bilbo. "Bother burgling and everything I had to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire with the kettle just beginning to sing." It was not the last time that he wished that. Still the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark. Wind got up, and the willows along the riverbank bent and sighed. I don't know what river it was, a rushing red one, swollen with the rains of the last few days, that came down the hills and the mountains in front of them. Soon it was nearly dark. The winds broke up in the grey clouds, and a warning moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper. "And where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on?" Not until then did they notice Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He'd eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he was simply not there at all. "Just when a wizard would have been most useful too," groaned Dori and Nori, who shared the hobbits' views about regular meals plenty and often. They decided that, in the end, they would have to camp where they are. So far they had not camped before on this journey, and thought that they knew they soon would have to camp regularly. When they were among the misty mountains and far from the land of respectable people, it seemed that a bad wet evening to begin on. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip, drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gotten in the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere, at almost anything. Wind or no wind, but they could not do it at night. Not even Oin or Gloin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took a fright and nothing, and bolted. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, feeling and Gillian were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that was carried and washed off him. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper, and less for breakfast. They were all glum and wet and muttering, while Oin and Gloin were trying to light a fire and quarrelling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures are not all pony rides in May's sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill some way off with the trees, pretty thick in parts, out of the dark mass of trees, they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire of torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they could go and see, and anything was better than a little supper, less breakfast and wet clothes all night. Others said, these are parts are not known well to other, not too well known, and are too near the mountains. Travellers seldom come this way. The old maps are of no use. Things have changed for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom even heard the king round here. And they are less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find. Some said, after all, there are 14 of us. Others said, where's Gandalf got to? This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Oin and Gloin began to fight. That settled it. After all, we got a burglar with us, they said. So they made off, leading their ponies with due and proper caution in the direction of the light, and they came to the hill, were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead into a house or a farm. They made a deal of rustling and cracking and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and drafting, as they went through the trees in pitch dark. Suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. Now it is the burglar's turn, they said, meaning Bilbo. You must go on and find about all that light and what it is for, and if it's all perfectly safe and canny, said Thorin to the Hobbit. Now scuttle off and come back quick as all's well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can. Off Bilbo had to go before he could explain that he could not even hoot once like any kind of owl, and any more fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quickly and quietly in woods, absolutely quietly. They take a pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once that he called all this dwarvish racket. As they went along, I don't suppose you or I would notice anything on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo, walking primarily towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, disturbing without anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell, and there was also a barrel of good drink in hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls, obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that, from their grey, heavy faces on them, and their size and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing-room fashion at all. Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow, said one of the trolls. Never a blinking bit of man-flesh we've had for long enough, said a second. What the hell William was thinking to bring off all these pots beats me, and the drink running short. What's more, he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. Shut your mouth, he said as soon as he could. You can't expect folk to stop here for every just to beat at you about. You've a village and half a between you. Since we come down from the mountains, how much more do you want? And time's been up our way, when you'd have your big thank you, Bill, for a nice bit of fatty, fully mutton like this. He took a bite off the sheep's leg, who was toasting, and wiped his lip off his sleeve. Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only 1 head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quickly and quietly, and warned his friends there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand, either in a nasty mood, quite likely to try toasted dwarf, or even pony for a change. Or else he should have done a good bit of burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the troll's pockets. It is nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. pinched the very mutton off the spit, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others, more practical but with less professional pride, perhaps would have stuck a dagger in each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent charily. Bilbo knew it. He had read a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed and as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet, somehow he could not go straight back to Thorn and Company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of various burglaries proceedings, he had heard of picking Troll's pockets seemed the least difficult, so at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrow. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked the courage into a little ham in William's enormous pocket. There was a person, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! He thought, warming his new fork, as he carefully lifted out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are mischief, and this was no exception. Who are you? It squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round and once grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. Blimey, Bert, look what I've got. What have I got? Said William. What is it? Said the others, coming up. Look at me, if I knows. What are you? Bilbo Baggins, Hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. A Hobbit? They said, a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake and mighty suspicious of anything new to them. What's a Hobbit got to do in my pocket anyways? Said William. And can ye cook 'em? Said Tom. Ye can try, said Bert, picking up a skewer. He would make more than a mouthful, said William, who had already had a fine supper. Not when he's skinned and boned. P'raps there's more like it round these parts, and we might make a pie, said Bert. Here, you. Are there any more of your sort sneaking around in these woods, you nasty little rabbit? Said he, looking at the hobby's furry feet, and he picked them up by the toes and shook 'em. Yes, lots, said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friend away. No, none at all. No, not one, he said immediately afterwards. What do you mean? Said Bert, holding him right away up by the hair this time. What I say, said Bilbo, and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I am a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook. If you see what I mean, I'll cook beautifully, a beautiful breakfast for you, if only you were having a supper. Poor little blighter, said William. He had already had much supper as he could, also had lots of beer. Poor little blighter, let him go. Not till he says what he means, and lots and none and all, said Bert. I don't want to have me throat cut and me slip. Hold his toes in the fire till he talks. I won't have it, said William. I caught him anyway. You're a fat fool, William, said Bert, as I've said afore this evening. You're a lout, and I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins, said Bert, and put his fist in William's eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet, and before they were fighting like dogs, and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in each other's arms and rolling nearly the fire, kicking and thumping while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that, of course, only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time Bilbo to left, but his poor little feet had been so very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round and round, so there he lay just panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight came Balin. The dwarves had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one, creeped towards the light quickly and quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin coming from the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately with a sack, and "A sack, Tom! Quick!" they said, before Balin, who was wondering where all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. A sack over his head, and he was done. "There's more to come yet," said Tom. or I'm a mighty mistook. Lots and none and all it is, said he. No burra hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves. That's about the shape of it. I reckon you're right, said Bert, and we'd best get them out of the light. And so they did. With their sacks in their hands they used for carving up and carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows, and as each of the dwarf came up in the fire, and spilled jugs and gnawed mutton in surprise, pop! Went a nasty smelly smack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin bade by Balin, and Feely and Keely together, and Dory and Ori and Ori all in a heap, and Oin and Gloin and Biffer and Buffer and Bobber and piled comfortably near the fire. That'll teach 'em, said Tom, for Biffer and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarves will when cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of stacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off, and said, "What's all this trouble? Who's been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from a tree. They'd forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with the sacks," said he. "Oi, are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught a big branch from fire at the one end, and Bert got his eye battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught a hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick and as young as a tree trunk, but it sent him spinning up into the top of some bushes. When Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl. I can tell you, but just at that moment, William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorin's head, and down to his toes, and so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks with 3 angry trolls, and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them with a fine tooth and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo, up in a bush, with his clothes and skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves and eat him later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument they all agreed to it. "No good roasting him. It'll take all night," said a voice. Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken. "You are." "You are a liar," said William. So the argument began all over again, and in the end they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a black pot and took out all their knives. "No good boiling them. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom's. "Shut up," they said, "or we'll never have done, and you can fetch your water yourself if you say any more." "Shut yourself," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "Who's arguing but Lou, I'd like to know?" "You're a booby," said William. "Booby yourself," said Tom. And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever, until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them, and boil them next time. "Who shall we sit on first?" said the voice. "Better sit on that last fellow." "Better sit on the last fellow first," said Bert, whose eyes had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking. "Don't talk to yourself," said Tom. "But if you want to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he?" "The one with the yellow stockings," said Bert. "Nonsense, the one with the grey stockings," said Williams. "I made sure it was yellow," said Bert. "Yellow it was," said William. "Then what you say it was grey for?" said Bert. "I never did. Tom said it." "That I never did," said Tom. "It was you 2-to-1, so shut your mouth," said Bert. "Who are you talking to?" said William. "Now stop it," said Tom and Bert together. "The night's getting on, and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it." "Dawn take you all and be stoned to you," said a voice that sounded like William's, but it wasn't, for just at that moment the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood stunned, turned to stone as he stooped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds perch on them, For trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff that the mountains are made out of, and never move again. This is what happened to Bert and Tom and William. "Excellent," said Gandalf, as he stepped from behind a tree and helped Bilbo to climb down of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling until the light came and made an end of them. The next thing was to untie the sacks and let the dwarves out. They were nearly suffocated and were very annoyed. They had not at all enjoyed lying there and listening to trolls making plans of roasting and squashing them and mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what had happened to him twice over before they were satisfied. "Silly time to go practicing pincing and pocket-picking," said Bomber, "when we wanted was fire and food." And that's just what you have gotten out of these fellows without a struggle in any case," said Gandalf. "Anyhow, you are wasting time. Don't you realize the trolls must have had a cave or hole dug somewhere near to hide in the sun in? We must look into it." They searched about and soon found the marks of a troll's stony boots going away through the trees. They'd followed the tracks up the hill until, hidden by bushes, they came on a big door of stone leading to a cave, but they could not open it. Not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations. "Won't this be any good?" said Bilbo, when they were getting all tired and angry. "I found it on the ground where the trolls had their fight." He held out a largish key, and though no doubt William had thought it was a very small and secret, it must have fallen out of his pocket, very luckily, before he was turned to stone. "Why on earth didn't you mention that before?" they cried. Gandalf grabbed it and fit it inside the keyhole. Then the stone door swung back with one big push, and they all went inside. There were bones on the floor and a nasty smell in the air, but there was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on shelves on the ground, among untidy litter of plunder. All sorts of, from brass buttons to pots full of gold standing in the corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls. I am afraid they belonged to victims, and among them were several swords of various makes, shapes, and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly, because they had beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin took one of each, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for a hobbit. "These look like good blades," said the wizard, half drawing them and looking at them curiously. "They were not made by any troll, nor by any smith among men in these parts and days, but when we can read the runes on them, we shall know more about them." "Let's get out of this horrible smell," said Feely. So they carried out pots of coins and such food as was untouched and looked fit to eat, also one barrel of ale which was still full. By that time they felt like breakfast, and being very hungry they did not turn their noses up at what had gotten from the troll's larder. Their own provisions were very scanty. Now they had bread and cheese and plenty of ale and bacon to toast in the embers of the fire. After that they slept, for their night had been disturbed, and they did nothing more till the afternoon. Then they brought up their ponies, and carried away many pots of gold, and buried them secretly not far from the track of the river, putting a great many spells over them, just in case any had the chance to come by and recover them. When that was done, they all mounted once more and jogged along the path towards the east. "Where did you go, if I may ask?" said Thorin to Gandalf as they rode along. "To look ahead," said he. And what brought you back in the nick of time?" "Looking behind," said he. "Exactly," said Thorin. "But how could you be more plain?" "I went to spy out our road. It would soon become dangerous and difficult. I was also anxious about replenishing our small stock of provisions. I had not gone very far, however, when I met a couple of my friends from Rivendell." "Where's that?" asked Bilbo. "Don't interrupt," said Gandalf. "You will get there in a few days if we're lucky, and find out all about it. As I was saying, I met two of Elrond's people. They were hurrying along for fear of the trolls. It was they who told me that there were 3 of them had come down from the mountains and settled in the woods not far from the road. They had frightened everyone away from the district, and the wayward strangers. I immediately had a feeling that I was wanted back. Looking behind, I saw a fire in the distance and made for it. So now you know. Please be more careful next time, or we shall never get anywhere." Thank you, said Thorin. And that's the end. Hope you enjoyed. Chapter 3 coming out soon, I guess.